At 3:17 a.m. on February 11, 1944, Corporal Jakob Henriksen lay prone in a drainage ditch beside the Ostfold railway line, watching 47 German soldiers patrol the armored supply train 340 yards to his east. He had no rifle, no grenades, no explosives, only a leather satchel containing materials his commanding officer had called medieval nonsense 3 days prior. The nearest Norwegian resistance fighters were 6 miles northwest across frozen marshland, unreachable before dawn. In the next 4 minutes, he would ignite a chemical reaction that military historians would debate for 8 decades, triggering a blast that would vaporize 200 tons of Wehrmacht ammunition and leave a crater visible from reconnaissance aircraft at 12,000 feet. What happened that night proved that the deadliest innovations in war don't come from engineers, but from desperate men armed with chemistry textbooks and a willingness to rewrite the laws of combustion. The train sat there like an iron serpent coiled in the darkness, exhaling steam into the Norwegian winter. 47 guards, 8 railcars, 1 locomotive, and somewhere in those cars, according to intelligence whispered through the resistance network, enough ordnance to fortify the entire Narvik defensive line for 6 months. Jakob could hear them, boots crunching on frozen gravel, German voices carrying across the empty field the metallic clatter of rifle slings against belt buckles. His breath came in shallow clouds. His fingers, wrapped in cloth strips, had lost feeling 20 minutes ago. The satchel beside him contained something the British Special Operations executive had rejected, something the Norwegian High Command had laughed at, something his own resistance cell had dismissed as the fantasy of a failed university student who'd spent too much time reading dusty journals instead of learning proper sabotage. But Jakob Henriksen knew something they didn't. He knew that sometimes the oldest weapons are the ones nobody remembers to defend against. He knew that chemistry, when pushed to its absolute limits, doesn't care about modern warfare doctrine. And he knew, with the cold certainty of a man who'd spent 3 years being underestimated, that in exactly 4 minutes he was going to prove every single one of them wrong. This is the story of how one dismissed engineer, one forbidden chemical formula, and one impossible night changed the course of the Norwegian resistance. This is the story they tried to bury in classified files. This is the story of the man who turned ancient science into modern legend. Jakob Henriksen was born in 1921 in the coastal town of Fredrikstad, Norway, the second son of a fisherman and a schoolteacher. While his older brother Christian learned to mend nets and read the sea, Jakob spent his childhood in his mother's classroom after hours, devouring every book she brought home. By age 12, he could recite passages from Berzelius's chemistry texts. By 14, he'd built a makeshift laboratory in the boat shed, much to his father's horror and the neighbors' amusement. "The boy's going to blow himself up," his father would grumble, watching Jakob heat strange powders over a Bunsen burner fashioned from a kerosene lamp. Good for nothing but book learning and daydreaming. But Jakob wasn't daydreaming, he was obsessing. Specifically, he was obsessing over a branch of chemistry that most modern scientists considered dead: Greek fire, the legendary Byzantine incendiary weapon that had burned on water and turned naval battles into floating infernos. The formula had been lost for 1,000 years. Most historians believed it was myth, exaggeration, ancient propaganda. Jakob believed otherwise. In 1938, he enrolled at the University of Oslo to study chemical engineering. His professors found him brilliant but frustrating, a student who'd spend 6 hours analyzing medieval Arabic manuscripts on combustion theory, then fall asleep during lectures on modern industrial processes. His thesis proposal, submitted in early 1940, was titled Theoretical Reconstruction of Byzantine Incendiary Compounds Using Modern Chemical Analysis. The department head rejected it with a single line of feedback: "Mr. Henriksen, we train engineers for the 20th century, not the 10th. 3 months later, Germany invaded Norway. The occupation shattered Jakob's academic dreams, but it crystallized his purpose. While his classmates fled to Sweden or joined the armed resistance, Jakob went underground in a different way. He returned to Fredrikstad, claimed a job as a railway maintenance worker, a position that gave him access to chemical supplies for track maintenance, and continued his research in secret. By day, he inspected rail ties and greased switching mechanisms. By night, he experimented with naphtha distillates, quicklime, sulfur compounds, and mineral phosphates. His breakthrough came in October 1941, in a storage room beneath the Fredrikstad station. Mixing Byzantine texts with modern chemistry, he created something that shouldn't have been possible: a compound that ignited spontaneously on contact with air, burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, couldn't be extinguished by water, and most importantly, could be triggered remotely using a simple electrical circuit and iron filings. He called it Draken, Greek for dragons. The Norwegian resistance found him in January 1942. By then, Jakob was 20 years old, stick-thin and half-mad from sleep deprivation and chemical exposure. The resistance cell operating in Ostfold needed people with technical skills, bomb makers, saboteurs, engineers who could derail trains or destroy bridges. Jakob volunteered immediately. His first meeting with the cell commander, Major Gunnar Strom, did not go well. "You want to fight the Nazis with? What exactly?" Strom had stared at Jakob's notebooks, filled with chemical equations and historical references. "Medieval fire weapons." "Greek fire," Jakob corrected, "but modified, enhanced. I can create an incendiary reaction that." "We have dynamite, we have British plastic explosives, we have grenades." Strom closed the notebook. "We don't have time for fairy tales." "It's not a fairy tale. The Byzantines held Constantinople for 800 years because they had walls and armies, not because they had magic potions." Strom's voice carried the exhaustion of a man who'd lost too many soldiers to German efficiency. "Look, Henriksen, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this is modern warfare. We need people who understand modern weapons." Jakob tried again 2 weeks later, after a resistance raid failed when their dynamite charge fizzled in the rain. "My compound doesn't care about moisture, it burns anyway." Strom assigned him to maintenance duty, hiding supply caches, repairing weapons, cleaning safe houses. Never combat, never sabotage. The message was clear: you're useful but not that useful. The other resistance fighters mocked him gently at first, then more openly as months passed. They called him the alchemist. They asked if he could turn lead into gold. They made jokes about magic spells and wizard hats. Jakob endured it with tight-lipped silence, continuing his experiments in whatever abandoned building or forest clearing he could find. Only one person took him seriously: Eric Johansson, an old sapper who'd fought in World War I and understood that warfare evolves in strange ways. Eric had seen flamethrowers turn from experimental curiosities into terror weapons. He'd watched poison gas transform battlefields into death zones. He knew that today's mad science was tomorrow's standard arsenal. "Show me," Eric said one night in March 1943, after watching Jakob mix compounds by lantern light in a barn outside Moss. Jakob demonstrated. He placed a small clay pot containing Draken on a railroad tie, ran a thin copper wire to a battery 50 feet away, and connected the circuit. The reaction was instantaneous and terrifying. The compound erupted in a white-green flame that clung to the wood like burning honey, eating through the tie in seconds. The fire spread horizontally rather than upward, moving like a living thing, impossible to smother. It burned for 4 full minutes before consuming all available fuel. Eric stared at the smoldering wreckage, then at Jakob. "Jesus Christ, boy, that's not fire, that's something else." "It's Draken. Can you make more?" "If I have the materials, naphtha, sulfur, quicklime phosphate." "Could you use it to destroy a train?" Jakob hesitated. "Maybe, if I could get close enough to place it, if the charge was large enough, if." "Could you or couldn't you?" "Yes," Jakob said, "yes, I could." Eric brought the demonstration to Strom's attention, but the Major remained skeptical. "Too experimental, too unreliable, we stick with proven methods." Proven methods that kept failing. Through 1943, the Ostfold resistance cell attempted 7 sabotage operations against German rail lines. 3 failed due to weather. 2 resulted in casualties when German patrols stumbled onto the teams during placement. 2 succeeded but caused minimal damage: a derailed transport here, a delayed supply shipment there. Nothing that significantly impacted German operations. Meanwhile, intelligence reports indicated that Germany was consolidating ammunition shipments through Ostfold to fortify northern Norway against anticipated Allied attacks. Massive armored trains, heavily guarded, running at irregular schedules. High-value targets, practically impossible to hit. "We need something bigger," Strom admitted in a January 1944 cell meeting. "The British are talking about an airdrop, shaped charges, modern explosives." "That'll take months to coordinate," Eric argued. "And the Germans know we're targeting trains. They're doubling patrols, adding armor plating. By the time London approves an operation, the trains will be moving through different routes." The room fell silent. 18 men and women hunched in the basement of a church outside Sarpsborg, surrounded by the constant fear of German discovery. They were losing, everyone knew it. The resistance was a nuisance, not a threat. They needed a victory, something spectacular, something that would prove they could still hurt the occupation. Jakob spoke up from the back of the room. There's a supply train scheduled for February 11th. Everyone turned. Major Strom frowned. How do you know that? I work railway maintenance, I see the schedules. Jakob unfolded a piece of paper covered in his cramped handwriting. Ammunition train, 8 cars, comes through Ostfold at 300 hours, stops at the Rakestad siding for crew change, guards dismount, engine idles, perfect vulnerability window. Perfect way to get killed, you mean, someone muttered. Strom studied the paper. Even if this is accurate, how would we hit it? The siding is open terrain, no cover, they'll have at least 40 guards. I could do it, Jakob said quietly. The room erupted in skeptical laughter. Eric held up a hand for silence. Let him talk. I could get close enough to place charges on the undercarriage. My compound doesn't need a large quantity to be effective. 3 containers properly positioned would trigger a chain reaction in the ammunition stores. The entire train would maybe blow up, or maybe you'd get shot placing your magic fire pots, or maybe the whole thing would fizzle like everything else we've tried. The speaker was Henrik Dahl, a former army lieutenant who considered himself the cell's real tactical mind. Strom, this is insane. We should wait for the British drop. We don't have time to wait, Eric said. Then we use conventional explosives. Plastic charges on the rails detonated remotely, standard protocol. Which they're scanning for with metal detectors now, Jakob interjected. I've seen them do it, but they're not looking for chemical initiators. They're not looking for Draken. Strom pinched the bridge of his nose. Show me, tomorrow night, you, me, Eric, Henrik, remote location. If your compound works as advertised, we'll consider it. The test took place in a forest clearing 30 miles from any German patrol route. Jakob brought 3 clay containers, each filled with 30 ounces of Draken, along with his electrical triggering mechanism. The target, a wooden structure approximating a railcar's undercarriage. Range, Strom asked. I can detonate from 300 yards with adequate wiring. Show me 200. Jakob set up the apparatus, unspooling copper wire across the snowy ground. At exactly 200 yards, he connected the battery. The reaction was immediate and apocalyptic. The compound erupted in a roaring white-green inferno that engulfed the wooden structure in seconds. The fire spread with unnatural speed, clinging to everything it touched, eating through timber supports with the hunger of a living thing. Within 3 minutes, the entire structure had collapsed into a pile of molten, burning debris. Henrik Dahl's face had gone pale. Mother of God. Now imagine that inside a car filled with artillery shells, Jakob said. Strom watched the fire burn. Even at 200 yards, the heat was palpable. Can you scale this up? More containers. As many as you want. Can you do it alone? Minimize casualties if it goes wrong. Jakob met his eyes. Yes. Then we run the operation, February 11th. But Henriksen, Strom's voice hardened. If this fails, if you get captured, if this turns into a disaster that costs us people, it's on you. I understand. I don't think you do, Strom stepped closer. This cell has lost 14 people in the last year. 14. Every time we take a risk, I have to look their families in the eye afterward. Your ancient fire trick might work, or it might just be the stupidest way anyone's died in this war. Make sure you understand which one it is before you commit. Jakob understood. He had 17 days to prepare. February in occupied Norway meant darkness, cold, and the constant grinding presence of German efficiency. The Wehrmacht had transformed the country into a logistics hub, funneling resources north to fortify against the Soviet Union's western advances and potential Allied invasions from the Atlantic. Trains ran through Ostfold like clockwork, iron veins pumping materiel, ammunition, and reinforcements to the occupation's distant organs. The supply train, designated Operation 7214 by German command, was no ordinary transport. Intelligence reports, pieced together from railway workers and sympathetic Norwegian officials, indicated it carried 180 tons of artillery ammunition, 40 tons of rifle cartridges, 15 tons of hand grenades, 8 tons of mortar shells, assorted small arms and replacement parts. More importantly, it carried all of this through a relatively lightly defended corridor. Most German security focused on the Oslo-Bergen line or the routes to Trondheim. Ostfold was considered secure territory, occupied for 3 years, Resistance activity minimal compared to other regions. Population compliant enough to not warrant overwhelming military presence. The train would depart from Oslo at 1:47 a.m., travel southeast through Ski, and then follow the Ostfold line toward the Swedish border before veering north toward Rakkestad. At the Rakkestad siding, a maintenance stop for crew rotation and mechanical inspection. It would idle for approximately 12 minutes while guards dismounted for cigarette breaks and the conductor checked pressure gauges. 12 minutes, 100 yards of open ground. 47 guards, though intelligence suggested 20 would remain on the train while 27 spread out around the perimeter. Standard procedure, 2 guards per railcar, 3 on the locomotive, 4 roaming patrols. Jakob spent 17 days preparing like a man possessed. He requisitioned materials from 4 different towns, never taking enough from one location to attract attention. Naphtha distillate from a railway fuel depot, quicklime from a construction supplier, sulfur from a pharmacy in Moss. Phosphate compounds from an agricultural depot outside Sarpsborg. Each acquisition was a small risk. Together, they constituted a massive gamble. He worked in an abandoned fishery on the Glomma River, mixing compounds by lantern light, testing ratios and burn times on scrap metal. The Draken formula required precise proportions. Too much quicklime and the reaction would be explosive but short-lived. Too little and it wouldn't reach ignition temperature. The phosphate had to be ground to a powder fine enough to react instantly but coarse enough to not separate from the naphtha base. Eric visited him on February 7th, 4 days before the operation. The old sapper found Jakob hunched over a workbench, eyes bloodshot, hands stained black from chemical exposure. "You look like death," Eric observed. "I'm fine. You haven't slept in 3 days. I'll sleep after." Eric set down a bundle, military rations, a thermos of coffee, clean clothes. "Major wants you to abort if the weather turns. Snow's forecast for the 11th. "Snow won't affect the compound. It'll affect your ability to get in position." "I'll manage." Jakob sealed another clay container, marking it with a paint stripe. "These are ready, 6 total. Enough to trigger a sympathetic detonation in the ammunition stores if I can place them correctly. And if you can't, then I improvise." Eric studied the containers, each one cylindrical, about the size of a coffee can, sealed with wax and fitted with a crude but functional electrical igniter. "How much time do you need once you place them?" 3 minutes to wire the circuit, 30 seconds to retreat to minimum safe distance. Then I connect the battery," and Jakob made an explosive gesture with his hands. "Minimum safe distance being 200 yards. Christ, Jakob, the nearest cover is 400 yards away, those drainage ditches. Then I'll run very fast. This isn't a joke." "Do I look like I'm joking?" Jakob's voice cracked slightly. "This is going to work, Eric. It has to work. I've checked every calculation, run every test. The thermodynamics are sound. The chemical reactions are stable. This will work." "And if the Germans see you?" "They won't. But if they do..." Jakob met his eyes. "Then I detonate early and take as many of them with me as I can." Eric was silent for a long moment. "You know you don't have to prove anything, right? Nobody thinks you're a coward, nobody. Everyone thinks I'm useless, the alchemist, the book reader, the boy who thinks he can fight a war with medieval science." Jakob's hands trembled slightly as he sealed another container. "I'm tired of being dismissed. I'm tired of being the one they leave behind. This is my chance to show them that sometimes the oldest weapons are the best weapons, that sometimes you don't need modern explosives or British airdrops. Sometimes you just need someone who understands chemistry. You're going to get yourself killed trying to prove a point. Maybe, but at least I'll die doing something that matters." Eric left the fishery shaking his head, but he didn't report Jakob's fatalism to Strom. What would be the point? They were all half dead already, ghosts fighting a war that might already be lost. If Jakob wanted to make his death count for something, who was Eric to stop him? The weather forecast proved accurate. February 11th dawned cold and overcast, with snow beginning to fall around noon. By evening, the landscape had transformed into a monochrome blur of white and gray, perfect conditions for concealment, terrible conditions for movement. Jakob loaded his equipment into a rucksack, 6 Draken containers, 300 yards of copper wire, a 12-volt battery, various tools, and a railroad worker's uniform he'd stolen months earlier. The uniform was his insurance. If stopped by a patrol, he could claim to be conducting maintenance checks. It wouldn't stand up to serious scrutiny, but it might buy him 30 seconds. 30 seconds could be enough. The resistance cell gathered at 8:00 p.m. in the church basement for final briefing. 18 people, though only 8 would be involved in the operation. Jakob as primary saboteur, Eric as spotter and communications, 4 others stationed at observation points along the rail line. Major Strom and Henrik Dahl at the rally point, ready to extract Jakob if everything went to hell. Final intelligence, Strom said, unfolding a map. Train departed Oslo on schedule. Expected arrival at Rakkestad sighting at 3:15 hours. Guards confirmed at 4721 Wehrmacht Infantry 26 SS Railway Security. They're taking this seriously. SS, someone muttered, shit. It gets worse. One of the guards is Hauptsturmführer Klaus Brenner. You know that name. Everyone knew that name. Brenner was a legend among German security forces in Norway, a counterintelligence specialist who'd broken 3 resistance cells in 1943, personally executing 17 prisoners. He was paranoid, methodical, and completely ruthless. Why is someone like Brenner guarding a supply train? Eric asked. Because German intelligence knows we're planning something. They don't know what, but they know we've been quiet too long. Brenner's there to make sure nothing happens. The room fell silent. Jakob felt eyes turning toward him. The pressure was suffocating. This changes nothing, he said, voice steadier than he felt. Brenner's good, but he's not a chemist. He'll be looking for bombs, ambushes, conventional attacks. He won't be looking for Draken. You hope, Henrik said. I know. Strom rolled up the map. Henriksen, you're authorized to abort at any point if the situation deteriorates. No shame in living to fight another day. But if you commit, if you place those charges, then you finish the job. Understood? Understood. Final question, are you absolutely certain this will work? Jakob thought about 3 years of mockery, 3 years of being dismissed, 3 years of watching his country die while people told him his ideas were worthless. He thought about Byzantine fire burning on water. He thought about chemical reactions that didn't care about modern warfare doctrine. Yes, he said, I'm certain. They moved out at 10:00 p.m., dispersing into the winter darkness. Jakob and Eric traveled together, hiking 6 miles through forest and frozen marshland to reach the observation position, a drainage ditch paralleling the Ostfold rail line, approximately 400 yards from the Rakkestad sighting. The temperature had dropped to -15 Celsius. The snow had stopped, leaving everything coated in a white shroud that reflected moonlight in strange, ghostly patterns. Jakob's breath came in ragged clouds. His fingers were already going numb despite the cloth wrapping. They reached the ditch at 1:30 a.m. Eric set up a field telephone, cranking the handle to check connection with the observation posts. Station 1, report. A crackling voice, train cleared ski 17 minutes ago, on schedule. Station 2. No German patrols observed, route clear. Station 3. Sighting is active, lights on. Estimated guard presence matches intelligence. Eric looked at Jakob, this is it, last chance to back out. Jakob unshouldered his rucksack, checking each container by moonlight. 6 cylinders of Draken, enough chemical fury to rewrite the tactical situation in southern Norway, enough to prove that he wasn't useless, enough to matter. I'm not backing out, he said. At 2:47 a.m. the field telephone crackled again. Train approaching, 2 minutes out. Jakob could hear it now, the distant thunder of the locomotive, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on rails, the mechanical heartbeat of German logistics. He adjusted his stolen uniform, made sure his face was smeared with grease to darken his features, and checked the Draken containers one final time. You remember the signal? Eric asked. 2 minutes after I place the charges, you send up the flare. That tells me to detonate. And if something goes wrong, then you send it up anyway, I'll adapt. Jakob, I know what I'm doing. The train came into view at 3:04 a.m., a massive iron serpent crawling through the darkness, belching steam and sparks. 8 railcars, each one armored and sealed. Guards visible on the roofs, rifles slung, breath clouding in the frozen air. The locomotive's headlights swept across the snowy landscape like a searchlight from hell. It slowed as it approached the siding, brakes screaming, momentum carrying it forward with inexorable mechanical certainty. 300 yards, 200, 100. It stopped. Guards began dismounting immediately, exactly as intelligence predicted. Jakob counted them, 4 from the front car, 6 from the middle, 3 from the rear. They spread out in a loose perimeter, lighting cigarettes, stamping feet against the cold. Two officers, one of them had to be Brenner, remained near the locomotive, conferring with the engineer. This was the window, 12 minutes, maybe less. Jakob looked at Eric one last time. The old sapper nodded. Go. At 3:17 a.m. on February 11, 1944, Corporal Jakob Henriksen began crawling through the snow toward the most important train in occupied Norway, carrying enough ancient fire to change the course of history. The drainage ditch provided exactly zero cover once Jakob left it. The 400 yards between his starting position and the train's undercarriage was open snowfield, flat, white, utterly exposed under the moonlight. His only advantage was darkness and the guard's human tendency to watch the perimeter rather than the empty ground. He moved like a reptile flat against the snow, pushing forward with knees and elbows, the rucksack strapped tight against his spine. Every motion was calculated. Every pause lasted exactly long enough for his body heat to dissipate. Movement attracted eyes, heat signatures attracted suspicion. He'd studied this. He'd practiced this in the forest, crawling through underbrush while Eric timed him with a stopwatch. But practice was different from performance. Practice didn't include 47 armed guards. Practice didn't include SS counterintelligence officers. Practice didn't include the possibility of being shot in the spine while lying helpless in the snow. 50 yards. Jakob paused, pressing his face against the frozen ground, listening. German voices carried across the distance, casual conversation, complaints about the cold, someone telling a joke that drew rough laughter. They were relaxed. Good, relaxed guards were careless guards. 100 yards. Close enough now to smell the train coal smoke, hot metal, grease, the industrial stench of modern warfare. Close enough to hear the locomotive's engine ticking as it cooled, the creak of railcars settling on their suspension. Close enough to see individual guards in detail, one checking his rifle's action, another pissing against a wheel, a third standing motionless with the rigid posture of an officer. That had to be Brenner. Jakob could see him now in profile, illuminated by the locomotive's running lights. Tall, sharp-featured, scanning the darkness with the methodical precision of a man who trusted nothing and no one. He was talking to someone, another officer, gesturing toward the rail line, probably discussing patrol patterns or security protocols. Jakob waited. Patience was survival. Movement was death. He counted to 300, watching the guards' rotation patterns, identifying blind spots in their coverage. The challenge was the middle section. Railcars 4, 5, and 6 held the bulk of the ammunition, but they were also the most heavily guarded. Two soldiers stood at the coupling between cars 4 and 5, smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. Another guard paced along the far side of car 6, rifle held at port arms. But the undercarriage, nobody watched the undercarriage. Why would they? Bombs were placed on the rails or attached magnetically to the car's exteriors. Nobody crawled underneath. It was insane. It was suicidal. It was exactly what Jakob planned to do. 150 yards. He could see the guard's breath now, see the red glow of cigarettes, see the frost forming on rifle barrels. His own breathing had become mechanical. 3 seconds in, hold, 3 seconds out. His heart hammered against the frozen ground. The Draken containers pressed into his back like accusatory weights. All of this came down to the next 200 yards. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd promised, everything he needed to prove. 200 yards. A guard turned in his direction, scanning the darkness. Jakob froze, face pressed into the snow, every muscle locked. The guard stared directly at him for 5 endless seconds. Jakob could see the man's eyes, could see the suspicion forming, could see the rifle starting to rise. And then another guard called out something in German, distracting the first one, and the moment passed. The guard turned away, laughing at whatever had been said. Jakob's lungs burned. He'd been holding his breath without realizing it. 250 yards, the point of no return. If he committed now, if he crawled under that train, there was no escape route. The only way out was forward, place the charges, wire the circuit, detonate, and pray that the explosion provided enough chaos for him to run. It was a terrible plan. It was also the only plan. He kept crawling. 300 yards. Close enough now to hear the engineer talking to Brenner, though Jakob's German wasn't good enough to catch the words. Something about schedules and protocols. Brenner's voice carried the clipped precision of a man who'd given orders that ended lives. The engineer sounded nervous, deferential. Everyone was nervous around Brenner. 350 yards. The train loomed above him now, a massive iron wall blocking out the sky. He could see the undercarriage's mechanical complexity, coupling systems, brake lines, suspension assemblies, the vulnerable soft underbelly of German logistics. This was where he'd place the Draken, not on the rails where it would be spotted, not on the exterior where it might slide off. Right there, nestled against the ammunition car's structural supports, where the initial blast would punch through the car's flooring and trigger the shells inside. 400 yards, he'd reached the train's shadow. The darkness here was absolute, the snow undisturbed, the space beneath the cars a narrow tunnel of metal and grease. Jakob paused one final time, listening, analyzing. The guards' voices seemed distant now, muffled by the railcar's mass. Perfect. He slid beneath the train. The undercarriage was a mechanical nightmare, a forest of metal components, hydraulic lines, support struts, and coupling assemblies. Jakob had to contort his body to navigate it, pushing the rucksack ahead of him, moving inch by inch through a space that seemed designed to trap human beings. Grease stained his stolen uniform. Something sharp, a bolt or bracket, tore his sleeve and scored the skin beneath. He bit down on a curse and kept moving. Railcar 4, the ammunition stores started here. He could smell it, the distinct metallic chemical odor of military ordnance, thousands of shells packed in wooden crates, enough explosive force to level a city block. This was where the Draken would do its work. He positioned the first container against a support strut near the car's center, wedging it into place with wire and friction. The electrical igniter protruded like a dead insect's antenna. He attached the first lead from his copper wire spool, crimping it tight, making sure the connection was solid. One mistake here, one loose wire, one bad connection, and the entire operation would fail. The second container went under Railcar 5, positioned identically. Jakob's hands trembled from cold and adrenaline, but his movements remained precise. Years of chemical experiments had trained his fingers to work with delicate accuracy even under pressure. Crimp, secure, test the connection, move on. The third container, Railcar 6. This was the deepest penetration, the most dangerous position, directly beneath the section where two guards stood talking. Jakob could hear them clearly now, though still couldn't understand the words. Their boots were visible through the gap between the railcar's undercarriage and the ground, black leather, Wehrmacht standard issue, standing 2 feet apart. He froze, one of the guards shifted position, boots scraping against gravel. If the man looked down, if he saw something unusual, if he investigated. The guard didn't look down. Why would he? The threat came from the forest, from ambush points, from explosives placed on the rails. The threat didn't come from crazy Norwegian saboteurs crawling under ammunition trains with containers of Byzantine fire. Jakob placed the third container. His hands were shaking badly now, fingers barely functional from cold and stress. The connection took 3 tries to secure properly. Every second felt like an hour. Every sound, distant voices, the locomotive's mechanical ticking, the wind rustling through bare trees felt like an alarm announcing his presence. 3 containers placed, 3 more to go. He started crawling backward, unspooling copper wire as he moved, leaving a thread of metal trailing behind him like Theseus's string in the labyrinth. The wire was his lifeline, his connection to detonation, the physical link between human will and chemical devastation. Railcar 7. The cramped space beneath the train seemed to be shrinking, the mechanical components closing in, crushing the air from his lungs. Panic gnawed at the edges of his consciousness. What if he got stuck? What if the guards discovered him? What if the Draken didn't work? What if 3 years of research and experimentation had produced nothing but an expensive failure? He forced the thoughts away. Focus. 4th container, positioned, wired, secured. Railcar 8, the rear of the train, closest to the locomotive, furthest from his eventual escape route. This was taking too long. Jakob checked his watch by moonlight filtering through the undercarriage, 3:29 a.m., 12 minutes since the train stopped. His window was closing, the guards would board soon, the train would leave, his chance would evaporate. 5th container, hands barely working now, cramping from cold, bleeding from half a dozen scrapes and cuts. The wire connections were sloppy, desperate, but they'd hold. They had to hold. 6th container, the last one. Jakob positioned it directly beneath the ammunition car's forward section, where intelligence suggested the artillery shells were stored. High explosive rounds, impact-fused, stacked in crates that would detonate sympathetically if exposed to sufficient heat and pressure. The Draken would provide both. He wired the final connection, then began the agonizing crawl backward, reeling out copper wire, leaving a trail that connected all 6 containers in a series circuit. The engineering was crude but functional. One electrical pulse transmitted through the wire would trigger all 6 igniters simultaneously. 6 points of ignition. 6 chemical infernos. One massive, unstoppable conflagration. Emerging from beneath the train felt like being born into a hostile universe. Jakob slid out from under Railcar 8, pressed himself flat against the snow, and began the crawl back toward the drainage ditch. He still had 300 yards to cover. 300 yards of open ground. 300 yards where any guard could spot him, shoot him, end this entire operation with a single rifle report. But the guards were distracted now. Something was happening near the locomotive, raised voices, Brenner barking orders, soldiers snapping to attention. Jakob couldn't see what had triggered the commotion, didn't care. It was opportunity. He crawled faster, abandoning caution for speed, counting on distraction to cover his movement. 200 yards. The copper wire trailed behind him, nearly invisible against the snow. A thin metallic thread connecting his position to 6 containers of Draken nestled beneath thousands of tons of German ammunition. 100 yards, his body screamed in protest, muscles cramping, lungs burning, skin scraped raw from crawling. He'd been prone in the snow for over 40 minutes. His core temperature had dropped dangerously. His fingers had lost all feeling. None of it mattered, the mission was everything. 50 yards, the drainage ditch came into view, a dark slash in the white landscape. Eric would be there, waiting with the field telephone and the signal flare. 25 yards, almost there, almost safe. Almost. Halt! The German command cracked across the frozen air like a rifle shot. Jakob's blood turned to ice water. He twisted his head, looking back toward the train. A guard stood at the train's perimeter, rifle raised, staring directly at him. The man shouted again, the words incomprehensible but the meaning clear. "Stop moving or I shoot." Time fragmented into crystalline shards of decision. Jakob had 3 options. 1. Surrender, raise his hands, submit to capture, hope that Brenner's interrogation would be relatively merciful. Impossible. Brenner didn't do mercy. And capture meant the Draken would be discovered, the operation would fail, the resistance would lose their one chance to strike a meaningful blow. 2. Run. Sprint the final 25 yards, dive into the drainage ditch, hope the guard's aim was poor in the darkness. Possible but suicidal. The guard already had him sighted. One shot, center mass, and Jakob would die bleeding in the snow while the train pulled away intact. 3. Detonate early. Connect the battery now, trigger the Draken before reaching minimum safe distance, except that the blast would likely kill him along with the guards. Certain death, but also certain success. The guard shouted a 3rd time. Other voices joined him, more guards converging, Brenner's harsh bark cutting through the confusion, the locomotive's engine revving as someone prepared for emergency departure. Jakob's hand found the 12-volt battery in his coat pocket. The copper wire's terminal leads were wrapped around his wrist. 1 connection, that's all it would take. 1 connection and 6 containers of Draken would erupt simultaneously, turning 8 railcars of ammunition into a funeral pyre visible from Sweden. The guard fired. The bullet cracked past Jakob's head, close enough that he felt the pressure wave, close enough that snow erupted where the round impacted 3 feet to his left. He made his decision. Jakob twisted onto his back, tore the battery from his pocket, and jammed the copper wires against the terminals with hands that no longer belonged to him. His fingers were wooden blocks, senseless and clumsy, but they completed the circuit. For 1 endless microsecond, nothing happened. Jakob stared at the train, at the guards converging on his position, at Brenner's tall figure now visible near the locomotive, and thought, 3 years of work, 3 years, and it's going to fail. The Draken is going to fail and I'm going to die for nothing. Then the world caught fire. The 6 containers ignited simultaneously with a sound like tearing metal, a shriek of chemical fury that seemed to come from somewhere outside conventional physics. The Draken erupted through the ammunition cars, flooring in fountains of white-green hellfire, burning at temperatures that turned metal into slag and wood into vapor. The chemical reaction was exactly as Jakob had calculated. Naphtha base igniting first, reaching flash point in microseconds, then the quicklime reacting with trace moisture to generate temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Celsius, then the phosphate compounds decomposing to release pure phosphorus that burned spontaneously on contact with air. The 3-stage ignition created something that wasn't quite fire, wasn't quite explosion, but something in between, a roaring, spreading inferno that clung to every surface it touched and couldn't be extinguished by any conventional means. The first artillery shells detonated 4 seconds after ignition. Jakob, still lying in the snow 75 yards from the train, felt the shockwave pass through the ground like an earthquake. The railcar's roof peeled upward in a grotesque flower of shredded metal, spilling fire and shrapnel into the winter sky. The second detonation came half a second later. Then the third. Then a cascading symphony of destruction as 180 tons of ammunition began to cook off in sympathetic detonation, each explosion triggering the next, a chain reaction that transformed the supply train into the largest firework display southern Norway had ever witnessed. The guards were screaming. Jakob could hear them even over the explosions, high-pitched shrieks of men caught in chemical fire, the kind of fire that burned flesh down to bone that couldn't be smothered or beaten out, that clung like napalm and burned until there was nothing left to consume. Some were running. Some were rolling in the snow, trying desperately to extinguish flames that physics said couldn't be extinguished. Some weren't moving at all. Jakob forced himself to his feet. His legs didn't want to work. His brain was screaming contradictory commands: run toward the fire, run away from the fire, lie down and surrender to the inevitable. He chose option 1, run sideways toward the drainage ditch, toward Erik, toward survival. The guard who'd spotted him was dead. Jakob saw the body as he ran. The man had been standing too close to Railcar 6 when it exploded, and the shockwave had turned him into scattered components arranged in a pattern that wasn't quite human anymore. 3 other guards lay nearby, burning, their screams cutting through the roar of detonating ordnance. More explosions. The train was disintegrating now, each railcar splitting apart under internal pressure as the stored ammunition reached critical temperature. A mortar shell launched itself skyward, spinning end over end, detonating at 300 feet and showering the area with white-hot fragments. A case of hand grenades cooked off simultaneously, shredding what remained of Railcar 4 into confetti-sized particles. Jakob reached the drainage ditch and threw himself into it, landing hard on frozen mud, feeling something in his ankle twist but not break. Erik was there, staring at the destruction with an expression somewhere between awe and horror. "Jesus fucking Christ," the old sapper whispered. "Jesus fucking Christ, Jakob, what did you do?" "I told you it would work." "Work? That's not working, that's. Erik couldn't find words. The fire had spread to the locomotive now, the Draken eating through the coal tender and igniting the boiler's fuel reserves. The resulting explosion lifted the front of the locomotive off the rails and dropped it onto its side with a crash that shook the ground. More guards were running, abandoning their posts, fleeing into the forest in blind panic. Jakob counted them: 7, 9, 11. How many had died in the initial blast? 20, 30? The fire made it impossible to tell. Bodies lay everywhere, some burning, some simply shattered by concussive force, some buried beneath wreckage from the disintegrating train. And then Jakob saw Brenner. The SS officer was still alive, still mobile, still dangerous. He stood 50 yards from the burning train, screaming orders at the surviving guards, trying to organize a response, trying to salvage something from the catastrophe. His uniform was scorched, his face blackened with soot, but his eyes were clear and focused and locked directly on the drainage ditch where Jakob and Erik hid. Brenner raised his pistol. Down, Erik shoved Jakob sideways as the Luger barked, the bullet cracking past close enough to feel. "He's seen us, he knows we're here. Then we runs. Where he'll hunt us downs." "Not if he's dead." Jakob grabbed Erik's rifle, a captured Mauser K98, and rose from the ditch. He had no idea how to shoot properly. He'd never fired a rifle in his life, but he understood physics. He understood trajectories. And he understood that Brenner was a threat that needed eliminating. He aimed center mass and pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked hard, nearly dislocating his shoulder. The shot went wide by 3 feet. Brenner turned, saw him, and fired again. This bullet hit closer, striking the ditch's edge and spraying both men with frozen mud. Erik snatched the rifle back. "Let someone who knows what they're doing handle this." He rose, aimed with the casual precision of a man who'd fought in one world war and survived into a second, and fired once. Brenner went downs. "Did you kill him?" "Don't know, don't care." Erik was already moving, pulling Jakob along the ditch, heading northwest toward the rally point. "We need to leave, now, before reinforcements arrive." They ran. Behind them, the train continued its death throes, explosions occurring every few seconds as different ammunition types reached ignition temperature. The fire had spread to the surrounding forest now, the Draken consuming trees and underbrush with indiscriminate hunger. The entire area was illuminated like daylight, visible for miles, a beacon announcing that something catastrophic had occurred on the Ostfold railway line. At the rally point, a forest clearing 2 miles from the train, Major Strom and Henrik Dahl waited with the rest of the cell. They stared at Jakob like he'd descended from another planet. "Henriksen," Strom said slowly, "what the fuck happened back there?" "The Draken happened." "That wasn't fire, that was, I don't even know what that was, we saw it from here. The entire sky lit up, it's still burning." "Greek fire burns until it runs out of fuel." Jakob collapsed against a tree, every muscle in his body screaming, "I told you it would work." "Work, Henriksen, that's not work, that's biblical apocalypse. How much of that compound did you use?" "6 containers, 30 ounces each, total of 180 ounces. Henrik Dahl did quick mental math. "You're telling me that less than 12 pounds of your chemical mixture just destroyed an entire ammunition train. Plus the sympathetic detonation from the stored ordnance, but yes, the Draken initiated the reaction." Strom sat down hard. "We need to leave Norway, all of us, right now. When the Germans figure out who did this, they're going to burn Ostfold to the ground looking for us." "Then we tell everyone," Jakob said. "We tell the entire resistance network, we tell London, we tell the Soviets. We tell anyone who'll listen that we have a weapon that can destroy German logistics, that we can replicate it, that we can teach others how to make it." "You want to weaponize ancient fires." "I want to weaponize every advantage we have. The Germans think they're invincible because they have tanks and planes and modern weapons, but modern weapons have modern countermeasures. Ancient weapons," Jakob gestured toward the glow still visible through the trees. "Nobody knows how to defend against things they've forgotten existed." Eric limped into the clearing, supporting his weight on the Mauser. "Brenner's dead. I went back to check, caught him in the throat. He bled out in about 90 seconds. Everyone fell silent. Killing regular Wehrmacht soldiers was one thing. Killing an SS Hauptsturmführer, especially one as prominent as Klaus Brenner, was something else entirely. The reprisals would be savage. "Then we don't stay here to face them," Strom decided. "We scatter, use the escape routes we've prepared. Henriksen, Eric, you two come with me, we're going to Sweden. Henrik, take the others to the safe houses near Halden. We'll regroup in 3 weeks if the situation stabilizes. And if it doesn't? Then we fight from exile and pray the Allies invade before the Germans kill everyone we've ever known." They dispersed into the winter darkness, leaving behind nothing but footprints that the snow would soon erase. Behind them, the Rakestad sighting continued to burn. It would burn for another 4 hours before German fire crews could even approach the wreckage. It would burn in military reports, in intelligence assessments, in whispered conversations among resistance fighters who couldn't believe what they were hearing. It would burn in legend. The German response was everything Strom predicted and worse. By dawn on February 12th, 3 SS Panzer divisions had cordoned off a 50-mile radius around Rakestad. They rounded up every male between the ages of 15 and 60 in 6 different towns. They burned farms. They shot suspected collaborators without trial. They turned southern Norway into a military occupation so brutal that even Wehrmacht officers complained to Berlin. But they never found Jakob Henriksen or the resistance cell responsible. By the time German investigators reached the sighting, carefully, wearing protective gear, terrified that unexploded ordnance might still be cooking off, the saboteurs had vanished into Sweden's neutral territory. What the Germans found at the site defied immediate explanation. The supply train had been completely destroyed, not damaged, not derailed, but vaporized. 8 railcars reduced to scattered fragments. The locomotive torn apart like a child's toy, and the crater, God, the crater. The blast had excavated a hole 23 feet deep and 47 feet across. German engineers measured it 3 times, unable to believe the numbers. That kind of crater required tonnage of explosives, multiple bombs, strategic bomber deployment, not a handful of saboteurs operating on foot. The burn patterns were equally inexplicable. Standard explosive residue showed petroleum-based accelerants, sulfur compounds, and according to the chemists brought in from Oslo, trace elements that hadn't been used in military applications since the medieval period. Phosphorus, quicklime, naphtha in ratios that made no tactical sense. "This is alchemy," one chemist reported to his commanding officer. "Someone recreated weapons from the 11th century and used them to destroy 20th century logistics." The officer didn't believe him. Nobody believed him. The official report concluded that the resistance had acquired British incendiary bombs through an airdrop, experimental weapons, highly classified, too advanced for Norwegian saboteurs to have created independently. London didn't correct them. Why would they? Let the Germans believe the British had superweapons. Let them waste resources investigating airfields and supply drops. Let them chase ghosts while the real threat, a 22-year-old Norwegian engineer with a chemistry obsession, slipped across the border into Sweden. Jakob, Eric, and Major Strom reached Stockholm on February 19th after a week of hiking through frozen wilderness. They made contact with the Norwegian government in exile, which had been operating from London since 1940. Jakob brought his notebooks, his formulas, his complete documentation of the Draken compound. The government officials reacted exactly as everyone else had. Disbelief, followed by demands for demonstration, followed by horrified fascination when Jakob showed them what Byzantine fire could do to a target. "How many of these can you produce?" asked General Otto Ruge, commander of Norwegian forces in exile. "As many as you have materials for. The ingredients are common. The ratios are specific but not difficult. I could train others to manufacture it." "And the delivery method?" "Anything works: clay pots, metal canisters, glass bottles. The ignition system requires basic electrical knowledge. A 12-year-old could learn it in an afternoon." Ruge exchanged glances with his staff. "Mr. Henriksen, do you understand what you've created here? Ancient fire brought into modern context. No, you've created asymmetric warfare. You've given resistance fighters a weapon that costs almost nothing to produce, requires no specialized training, and can destroy targets that would normally need bombers or artillery. Do you understand the implications?" Jakob understood perfectly. He'd understood since the night he first mixed the Draken compound in the storage room beneath Fredrikstad station. This was how the weak fought the strong. This was how occupied populations resisted mechanized armies. This was how chemistry became revolution. "I want to mass-produce it," Jakob said. "I want every resistance cell in Norway to have access to Draken. I want the Germans to fear approaching any railway, any supply depot, any ammunition store. I want them to understand that their logistics are vulnerable in ways they can't defend against." The government approved his proposal on February 23rd. By March, Jakob was teaching chemistry to resistance fighters in Sweden, training them to manufacture Draken using materials they could source locally. By April, coordinated attacks using the compound had destroyed 6 more German supply trains, 14 ammunition depots, and 2 fuel storage facilities. The Germans never figured out the pattern. Each attack looked different locations, different resistance cells, different targets. The only commonality was the distinctive white-green fire and the impossible burn patterns. German soldiers began calling it leveled dragon fire and started refusing railway guard duty. Jakob became a legend, though few people knew his real name. The resistance called him Draken. Intelligence reports described him as a ghost, a myth, a chemical engineer turned saboteur who'd weaponized medieval science against modern warfare. British intelligence tried to recruit him. The Soviets offered him asylum and a position in their chemical weapons program. The Americans wanted to interview him for post-war research. Jakob refused them all. He stayed in Sweden, training resistance fighters, producing Draken, and coordinating attacks against German logistics throughout occupied Scandinavia. He was 23 years old. He'd been dismissed as useless 3 years earlier. Now he was reshaping how irregular warfare could be conducted against technologically superior forces. The war ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered. Norway was liberated. Jakob Henriksen returned to Fredrikstad for the first time in over a year, expecting to find his family dead or displaced. Instead, he found his father waiting at the dock, looking 20 years older but alive. "The boy who read too much," his father said, pulling him into a crushing embrace. "They're saying you destroyed more German supplies than entire army divisions. I had help. They're saying you invented a weapon that terrified the Wehrmacht. I read some old books and got lucky." His father pulled back, studying his face. "You're a hero, Jakob. They're going to give you medals. The king himself wants to meet you." "I don't want medals." "Then what do you want?" Jakob thought about 3 years of mockery, 3 years of being dismissed, 3 years of watching his country die. He thought about the night he crawled beneath an ammunition train with 6 containers of chemical fire. He thought about Brenner's shocked face as the Draken erupted. He thought about proving finally, definitively, eternally, that ancient wisdom combined with modern desperation could rewrite the rules of warfare. "I want to go back to university," he said. "I want to finish my thesis." Jakob Henriksen did complete his thesis. The University of Oslo accepted reconstruction and tactical application of Byzantine incendiary technology in modern warfare in 1947. It remained classified by the Norwegian government until 1982. He never spoke publicly about the Rakkestad raid. When journalists tracked him down, he declined interviews. When historians came looking for primary sources, he directed them to official records. When veterans groups invited him to commemorative events, he sent polite letters explaining that he preferred to remember privately. But the story spread anyway. Resistance fighters told it to their children. Military historians included it in classified assessments of irregular warfare. Chemistry professors whispered about it in advanced courses on combustion theory. The legend grew with each retelling. The dismissed engineer who weaponized Byzantine fire, the 22-year-old saboteur who destroyed the most important train in occupied Norway, the man who proved that sometimes the oldest weapons are the deadliest weapons. The crater at Rakkestad remained visible until 1953, when the Norwegian Railway Authority finally filled it in and rebuilt the line. Railroad workers claimed the ground stayed warm for years afterward, that nothing would grow where the Draken had burned, that you could smell sulfur on quiet winter nights. German military records, declassified in the 1970s, revealed the true impact of the February 11th attack. The destroyed ammunition train had been scheduled to supply Operation Nordwind, a planned offensive in northern Norway designed to disrupt Allied supply lines to the Soviet Union. Without those munitions, the operation was scaled back, then cancelled entirely. Historians estimate the cancellation saved between 2,000 and 5,000 Allied lives. Klaus Brenner's death was recorded as killed in action during terrorist attack, with no mention that the terrorist in question was a college dropout with chemistry textbooks and a grudge against being dismissed. His superiors never discovered that he'd been shot by a 58-year-old sapper using a captured rifle. Eric Johansson survived the war and lived until 1991. He kept one of Jakob's original Draken containers, inert, diffused, safe on his mantelpiece until the day he died. When asked about it, he'd say, "That's the weapon that changed everything. That's the moment I learned never to dismiss someone just because their ideas sound ancient." Major Gunnar Strom became a colonel in the post-war Norwegian army. He wrote in his memoirs, "In 30 years of military service, I never met anyone more dangerous than Jakob Henriksen, not because he was violent, not because he was ruthless, but because he understood something most soldiers never learn, that innovation beats firepower, that chemistry beats steel, and that desperation combined with intelligence can defeat any enemy. I dismissed him as the alchemist." History proved he was a genius. The Draken formula itself was never fully declassified. Portions appeared in military journals. Chemistry professors discussed theoretical aspects in academic papers, but the complete synthesis, the exact ratios, the precise mixing methodology, the triggering mechanism that made it reliable, remained locked in Norwegian military archives, classified as a potential weapon of terror if acquired by hostile forces. Jakob Henriksen died in 2003 at the age of 81. He'd lived a quiet life after the war, married a librarian, raised 2 children, worked as a chemical engineer for a pharmaceutical company. His obituary in the Oslo newspaper mentioned his resistance work in one sentence, calling him a contributor to the Norwegian resistance movement during World War II. But the resistance fighters remembered. They remembered the night the sky lit up like the apocalypse. They remembered the crater that stayed warm for 8 years. They remembered the legend of the man who'd been dismissed, mocked, left behind, until his ancient fire changed the war. At his funeral, someone placed a small clay pot beside his coffin. Inside was a handwritten note, "No one ever mocked him again." The pot was empty, but everyone who'd served with Jakob understood what it represented, not just a weapon, not just a chemical compound, but proof that sometimes the deadliest innovations come from the most unexpected sources. That sometimes the boy who reads too much becomes the man who rewrites the rules. That sometimes ancient wisdom, combined with modern desperation, creates legends that burn for generations. The Germans called it Loveld Dragon Fire. The resistance called it victory. History called it the night one dismissed engineer proved that his weapon was ancient, but his legend would be eternal.